Hi, this is Greg Smythe, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by GlobalNL. The goal of the podcast is to share stories of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians doing interesting and amazing things, both at home in the province and around the world. This week's guest is Aatif Baskanderi, who has recently taken on the role as CEO of the North Pine Foundation, which is an organization that focuses on social innovation across Canada. During the episode, we discuss Aatif's experience growing up Muslim in Clarenville, Newfoundland, as well as his experience making a documentary on this very topic. We also talk about the importance of social entrepreneurship, as well as an emerging trend of racism in Newfoundland and across Canada. It was very interesting and inspiring to talk to Aatif and to hear his passion for making social change. I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I enjoyed recording it, and we look forward to sharing more stories like this in the near future.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. So my name is Aatif. I grew up in Clarenville. Right now, I'm living in Edmonton. Incidentally enough, I'm actually moving to Toronto in a few months, and I'm the CEO of the North Pine Foundation. So that's a foundation focused on social innovation across Canada.
Okay, yeah, I'd actually like to talk more about that maybe a little bit later. I've got some questions on your current role. But I guess we can start with, you were awarded one of the GlobalNL awards this year as kind of being an important part of the entrepreneurship community. And so anyways, first of all, congratulations and thank you for all your contributions to Newfoundland. And I think we'll start by talking about the documentary Salaam B'y that you produced and kind of starred in, and that did seem to kind of grow from an organic maybe Facebook post, but I'd love for you to tell us a little bit of the origins of that story and maybe how it's, I guess, changed your life. It seems like it's had a big impact on you. I'd be curious to learn more about it.
Yeah, so I guess it all started off on a day that my wife, who was a resident physician at the time, was doing a 26-hour call shift in the hospital. So I got bored and decided to write my story. I always was wondering about this, the story of a Muslim Newfoundlander, and if any other stories were out there of Muslim Newfoundlanders. And this was right after the election happened down in the US, where Trump got elected, and we saw, of course, rising racism and Islamophobia, even here in Canada. And when I thought of it, one of the big things and the flags that came to my mind, it's, you know what, I didn't want someone else telling my story for me, because that's typically what happens, is you get lots of other people who tell your story for you, who kind of paint a representation of you. And I said, I'm just going to tell my own, because when I did some quick Google searching, I never really found anything that put you in the shoes of a Muslim Newfoundlander. And from that blog post that I wrote on that day, it turned into a speaking tour going around Newfoundland Island. Unfortunately, we didn't make it up to Labrador, where we partnered with Newfoundland and Labrador public libraries, the school system, and we basically would visit schools, libraries, community centers around the province to just tell my story. And my wife, Nazia, she actually had the fantastic idea to say, you know what, maybe we can think bigger than just a speaking tour. Maybe we can scale it out a bit more. And she's the one who actually came up with the documentary idea. So from that, we started crowdfunding. I would say we initially pitched it to CBC, which actually was one of my favorite failure moments, because CBC passed on it. And that forced us to think differently. And because of that, we started crowdfunding. If anyone has ever done anything like that, you never know how much you're going to get. We thought getting $1,000 would be wonderful, but we ended up raising $16,000 from over 270 donors from 19 different countries. And then it all started from there. We got to hire a professional film team, an amazing director to join us on this tour of Newfoundland, created the film, and then there you go.
And so what did you learn? I guess, what did you learn by going through the process that maybe even about your own life or your own story that you probably didn't think you knew before?
There's actually a few different things I learned, and I'll start off from the beginning. The initial process of writing my story was actually a really interesting process. I started by just opening up a Google Doc and making a ton of bullet points reflecting on my life. And at the end of it, I had about 30 pages of bullet points about my life that I put down, and kind of harmonizing that into some kind of story. It was really just like fulfilling for myself. Is like that that kind of self-reflection. I know lots of people get fulfillment out of journaling and things like that. And then the other piece was how I learned that I can't tell other people's story for them. In the same way that I didn't really want someone else telling my story for me, I actually picked up the phone and had a call with some of my friends who grew up as other minorities in Newfoundland. So, for example, like one of my friends who was a Tamil guy, who's a Newfoundlander, another one who's half Chinese, half white, a friend who's atheist, a friend who's gay. And I just wanted to understand their journeys. And it became very apparent that I couldn't try to fit their stories into mine. Sometimes you try to resonate to many different audiences. And that just really helped me own my own story. And in doing that, it was really fascinating to see, by me owning my own story, the amount of people that gravitated towards it. So that was exciting.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I think it's interesting to see those perspectives. I think when you've been speaking, it comes to mind that my closest friend growing up was, he was born in Newfoundland, but he, his parents were first generation Indian, and he grew up in the Hindu religion, but went through Catholic school, and he didn't share a lot about what that experience was like, but it was just, but there was. But it kind of brings that to top of mind, and he still talks about what it was like to grow up as being Indian in Newfoundland, and the unique experiences that brought.
Yeah, and it was something like, so growing up as a brown Muslim in Newfoundland, when I was growing up, it was one of those things that I was just like, well, I was just like many other kids. I also had these things of my own culture that I really owned, and the one thing that I really appreciated is the community around me also appreciated that I owned that culture. So the fact of me being Muslim was a very positive thing, because to me, what that meant to my friends' parents is for example, I didn't drink growing up or even in university. And so like when my friends' parents would see like, oh, you could go hang out with Aatif, that's good. Like, he's a sensible one. And the other pieces of like, my friends also celebrated me kind of practicing my faith as well. I remember when I would like break my fast during Ramadan, like my friends would have big feasts with me. So it's kind of like, it would be a festive type thing. So the one thing I would say about Newfoundland is that I grew up in a Muslim community being surrounded by non-Muslims, because I was in this community that actually empowered me to be Muslim. And that was really wonderful.
That's great. And I think the other anecdote I have from my childhood was, I didn't have any exposure to like Muslim friends, or in my circles anyways, but when I was in high school playing basketball, one of the closest friends that I had at that time was Muslim. And I do remember the fasting part I never knew about. Right. And then we were in the middle of like very intense, like basketball training, and he wasn't allowed to eat, and he used to tell me stories about, I think certain times a year, depending on the cycle, right? His dad would get up at like 4 a.m. and cook like a huge meal, and he would eat, but then, and then to be able to eat kind of after dark. And the challenges, it was really tough. And it was something that I didn't really understand or only learned about when I was at that age,
Yeah, that's, and it's kind of interesting because, well, when I was, like you said, you kind of pointed out how the time of fasting changes each year because it follows the lunar calendar. So I remember like when I was a kid in Newfoundland, there's times where I would be like fasting during the wintertime, which basically meant skipping lunch because like it became dark so early that it wasn't a big issue. And now I'm in Alberta where like sunset can be like 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and I'll be fasting till then too. So, but it's interesting. It's really, once you get in the zone, it's really fulfilling, and it's like a good feeling to go through the process. And then the fact that I had this whole community around me that was supportive of it was great. So I actually have this one story that I share in my speaking tour of how, I think it might have been in 2010, I went back to Newfoundland for a friend's wedding. And for the bachelor party, a part of it is we all went to Raymonds restaurant. And of course, that being like an extremely fancy, really nice restaurant, we probably had no business being there, knowing us. But it was something where it was also during Ramadan, so I was fasting at the time. And Raymonds has one like these like 7/10 course type meals that we all went for. But when we got there, it was still before sunset. So my friend phoned up ahead, and he said, one of my friends is coming, he's fasting. And Raymond's like, good, that's fine. What we can do is we can sort it out so his meals come out at the time when it's sunset. So I get there to Raymond's, and the waitress comes to me and says, hey, you're the one that's fasting. I was like, yep. They're like, great. So what we do is like, we'll start serving your friends like when food is ready. I was like, yeah, that sounds good. And as soon as sunset hits, we'll bring out your first plate. I'm like, okay. And then they're like, what we'll do is we'll increase the frequency to a level that by the time you all hit dessert at the exact same time. So that was like a really nice show of consideration for like them, for like me with my friends in that moment. And then the other piece that really blew me away, it's as soon as sunset hit, I didn't have to tell anyone what time it was. The person from Raymonds came out with this little like cappuccino espresso sized cup of date infused milk. And I was blown away because for many people who may not know, dates and milk is like a very traditional way of breaking your fast. And I did not tell them about this. So here, the people at Raymonds kind of did their homework and said, we're going to make this guy's breaking of his fast a bit special for him. And they came out with that. And that showed me something really special, because I know one thing that Raymonds always tries to do is really champion Newfoundland culture from like a nature and food perspective. But a big piece of Newfoundland culture is the people side and the consideration and hospitality of people. And that's what I saw kind of permeate in that moment.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's a wonderful story. I mean, seems to be a wonderful restaurant, and they have a good understanding. But I think the people of the province are empathetic. I think the challenge is the exposure to diversity. A lot of times, and I don't know if you have a perspective on this, but it's, most of the sentiment, people just don't have exposure to a lot of other cultures, right? It's not a very diverse place in general. And I think a lot of people's, maybe it kind of comes back to maybe their lack of understanding or just exposure to like a diversity of people. And I think, but the openness to learn and to incorporate seems to be very positive.
It's interesting. And I've been thinking about that quite a bit, about the exposure piece. And maybe that is a case. And it's also what's the kind of exposure that you get. So when I was growing up as a kid in Clarenville, definitely were not that many brown Muslims around in Clarenville. Yeah. So if you wanted to know anything about Muslims, you like go talk to the Baskanderi family, essentially. But I mean, like when I was growing up, like they didn't necessarily have a whole lot of exposure. And yeah, sometimes you might get like the strange questions. But then I found like the real intention behind why people would ask those strange questions of like, why I didn't eat a certain food or why I didn't do this. And a lot of it was out of sincerity so that they can create a more welcoming environment for me. So they would ask me all types of questions about types of food I can eat, so that when I show up to my friend's birthday party as a kid, they have like separate food that I'm able to eat. And they're like aware of that. My one concern with exposure right now, it's because there's like, one of the reasons I also wrote the story is I saw like an emerging racism in Newfoundland, an emerging right-wing sentiment happening in Newfoundland. And when I think about exposure, it's nowadays when people think about Muslims, it might not necessarily be someone you know, but someone like just seeing stories covered on your Facebook newsfeed or in the media that paints a picture of a population that you may have never ever met before, but you think you know them just because that has been your exposure. And that's kind of one of my concerns, is like the type of exposure that people get and how it's framed to them and how that plants seeded memories in their mind of a community that starts to plant stereotypes and bias in people.
Yeah. I think like that, I mean, my concerns around social media, I think a lot of people have, and just like whether it's the echo chambers or amplification of like, very negative sentiment is scary. Because I think about, I really appreciate your perspective actually, because I think about the story of the Truxton and the Pollux. I don't know if you've heard it before, where basically like there was two Navy ships that ran aground on the south coast of Newfoundland, and and like the sailors kind of wash up on shore, and the local community basically saves them, and then there was a local person, they were covered in diesel fuel, this kind of thing, and there was a local woman like trying to clean the diesel fuel off this sailor, and he said, man, that's not coming off, that's the color of my skin,
Lanier Phillips.
Yeah. And that, I think that part of like isolation, they've just had no idea, and their exposure to the outside world and different cultures was effectively nothing at the time, and so I think the world's changed a lot since that time. But also now, like, the exposure is different, but like the social media aspects can give you like a very narrow view on the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I always have this, like, it's a term that came to my mind when I think about this, is what I framed as what I call agile sincerity, which is people are not going to know every single thing about every other culture that's out there, and that's completely fine. But it's like how you engage people in that moment that you encounter them with respect, integrity, and kindness. And I think for me, that's the key part. Like, I can't expect everyone to know everything about every culture that they come across. And that's not necessarily the litmus test for how inclusive people are for me. For me, it's kind of more how you treat anyone that's different from you, and any kind of biases that might come into play.
This is not, I don't know if related to that, but I was always curious about like how you treat everyone is how you treat everyone, in some way. And like, I can't remember, in some book I read, I think it was Chris Hadfield, the astronaut. And he used to say, like, trying to figure out who people are was a really important part of being an astronaut, because you had to live with them for months at a time. And what they used to do was when they'd go to get their medical, the admin staff and stuff, they would often ask like all the admin staff how the astronauts treated them. And it was a really interesting way to see, like, it's fine through interviews and all your technical work and your colleagues, but how do you treat the other people in your life, and it gave this, and it it sounded like it eliminated some people, that they were selectively understanding to people. And anyways, I thought it was an interesting way of assessing people.
That's an interesting. I never even thought of that. But like, it's almost like in space, you're in like a vacuum of physics, but you're also in like a social vacuum as well, where you kind of have to take all the realistic components of the people around you. So it makes sense that you have to be like extremely aware of those people around you.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's exactly. You're the most isolated place. It's kind of like being on an oil rig or somewhere else too. Maybe the dynamics are very isolating.
Yeah.
I know it sounds like you've lived, based on kind of the research I did beforehand, that you've lived outside the province for some time. I'm curious to know kind of two things: how you stay connected to the province. Obviously, this documentary was an important thing for you. And then like maybe like living away, have you gotten a better sense of like how growing up in Newfoundland shaped you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I am one of the pieces of the brain drain, I guess, from Newfoundland, where I left in 2008 after I graduated my undergrad at Memorial, tried to find a job locally, couldn't, ended up traveling elsewhere, and then since then kind of traveled around the world. I always like to say, it's interesting, and it kind of goes back to my previous point of like growing up surrounded in a Muslim community, surrounded by non-Muslims, is like, my faith is very important to me. And it's one of those things I really appreciate about Newfoundland is me being there. Newfoundland values actually connected a lot to my Muslim values, and back and forth in such a way that it helped me. But all that is like, it helps me understand myself. So what it has done, it's actually given me like this strong sense of self-awareness, which has been really helpful in my life, because I've traversed a lot of different regions, lived in different countries, worked in different positions. But having a strong sense of self is a key part of it. And I attribute that a lot to coming from Newfoundland. I also attribute like the idea of radical kindness. And I know like there's a debate in Newfoundland about like how kind are we really, but like how I grew up, it is how I grew up. So that was my story. I know there's many people who have different experiences, but that's kind of a lot of how I treat other people too. And then I actually find kindness, right, aside from being like a fluffy, nice thing to do, is actually one of the strongest assets someone can have as they have to navigate uncertainty in their life. Like a sense of self-awareness and kindness and how you engage others. It helps drive things like collaboration as you navigate different career pathways, moving into different areas. It allows you to connect with different people. So I think growing up in Newfoundland taught me that, which has helped me a lot.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And you do, it is interesting to hear your perspective on whether, there's like the nature of the community. I mean, I think it can be tough if I've heard feedback before that, like, if you're not from Newfoundland and you come, especially, I think you were pretty young when you moved to Newfoundland, if I know, but if you come at later stages, we used to have, excuse me just for a second. We used to have expats move from the States and things like that. They're kind of older adults and things like that. And it's a very tight knit community. And sometimes it's hard to integrate into a very tight knit community. And I think that's, it can't, when you're a part of it. And I just spent 2 months in Newfoundland, you kind of forget how tight knit the community is, and like how well connected people are. But I think it can be tough for people, coming into that tight knit community.
It's interesting, and it could be structural in the sense of, like I moved to Newfoundland when I was 5. So when you're a kid, you end up being like connecting to the community just by riding your bike down the street and other kids yelling at you, say, "Hey, come over and play." That's kind of like how I connected to the community. But to be honest, a piece of this is just like adulting, like being an adult and moving around to different places. I have yet to really see a community that moving in as an adult has actually been quite easy to break into. I find that's difficult, and I think a big piece of that is how is it that adults engage with each other? How is it that we build welcoming homes and welcoming communities for each other and for new people coming in, and how people can connect into that? I have no idea, but it's like a hypothesis that I think that it's a piece of being an adult. The only reason I say that is because I moved around to so many places in my adult life, and every single place is like the same kind of thing. There's always like a weird, convoluted pathway to build a community when you end up moving into somewhere new. There might be some places that are a bit more like transient communities where you get lots of people who just come in and out of there. Maybe like places like San Francisco or like Toronto that tend to create more venues that allow for more connection. But I don't know, I find it tricky to do in many places.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think because I've had a similar experience. I did a bunch of work terms in different cities, and then lived in Texas for 4 years and lived in California for the last 4 years. And it's hard. Like Houston was easier because there was a big Newfoundland community there. Kind of the oil industry alumni is there, and it was kind of relatively easy to integrate there. Although we noticed that, I think we used to call it like dating friends, and not to say you're trying to shop around, but trying to find like-minded people. It's easy, like when you work together, you kind of have work in common. But my wife and I are like very active and like to spend a lot of time in the outdoors, and we're like, we don't want to eat and drink all the time. It's nice to go for nice meals, but we're like, we really want to hang out with people that are active and playing sports and things like that. But it took a lot of effort, and it took, we used to say it takes like kind of 18 months to 2 years to really get to meet, to get integrated into a community like that. The other thing we learned was that you don't need that many close friends. You can't have, some people have these huge friend circles, but like, having 2 to 3 friends or close, couples or families is kind of all you need, and taking your time to build those relationships. But it does take time to build up those relationships.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I feel like that probably resonates to a lot of people listening to this, that, like the older you end up getting, the more you realize, like you said, you end up just getting a close-knit circle of people. It's not like the 100 friends that you might have had in university or whatever the case would be. And I lived in student residence in Bowater at MUN. Living in student residence, all of a sudden you're connected to like a community of 1,000 people. And I absolutely loved it. Like, it was amazing. But yeah, like you said, like once you get older, it's, I don't know if it's just like a common thing that you end up, your community just gets a bit smaller. And it could be that you got so many other things on the go as well.
Yeah, I think time, I've just realized as I get older, the time is so scarce, and between, having a busy job, doing some hobbies outside of it, trying to stay active, and then young kids, and there's just so little time, that you can't, you had to be careful about how big your circles are, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And so I do a lot of work in like social development and community engagement work. And that's actually, it's kind of funny, like my community building and my building of friends right now is actually typically built through work, which is built through kind of social impact work that I do. So pretty much all my community is connected to like social impact work that I've done, which many people, when you put the title of work on it, some people have different relationships with people that they work with at the different levels, but that's kind of pretty much my community right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're probably, a lot of people you're lucky to be able to kind of like mix like your passion probably with your work, and things are indistinguishable, which is that you're probably very lucky to get that.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, go ahead.
No, that was kind of next on the topics to talk about around, it seems, I think you have one of the longest LinkedIn profiles. You've had a lot of different jobs and positions, and don't take that as a negative thing. I mean, you have a lot of like unique experiences, and certainly like social impact, social entrepreneurship has been a big focus for you. That's obvious from reading through your profile. I'm curious to know kind of like why, maybe it's part of this story that we've talked about, but I'm curious to know kind of why you've gone down that path. And it looked like it started with maybe Engineering Without Borders, but I don't know if you can talk about maybe what some of the initial genesis on that career path you've chosen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually starting to figure out that it's more of the question for me was more of a why not? And this kind of the why not piece is what I uncovered through my journey of, actually, sometimes it can be quite difficult to do work in the social impact field. So here I was, this engineer, but when I was in high school, my favorite courses were physics, math, and social studies. No one ever, and I've always had this passion for social justice. No one ever told me that like a technology engineering nerd like myself could find a connection with social justice. It kind of just seemed like two mutually exclusive things, essentially. Yeah. And that was one of the exciting things I found, like when EWB, the chapter first came to MUN, I think it was like in my last year of university. And just seeing people having this conversation of like the connection between engineering and social development. From that, I drank the Kool-Aid way too hard. And when I moved to Ottawa after MUN, I worked at BlackBerry for a few years designing smartphones, but then I quit my job and went to do a master's in social policy and development at the London School of Economics. And I will say the why not piece is because when I graduated from LSE, I was extremely unemployable. Here I was, this person with an engineering degree with a master's in social policy, where I did not know which way to go because there wasn't any kind of so-called sector that was really embracing this. So when I spoke to engineers, they would look at me and be like, oh, so you left engineering and now you're gone off to do this social development stuff. And I was like, no, that's not really why. And then when I would go talk to charities, they would look at me being the engineer and be like, okay, like you're here to fix our computers. And I was like, no, that's not really why I'm here either. So trying to navigate that path was actually extremely tricky. There's like the difficult moments of like being unemployed, living in my parents' basement for a few months, not knowing what to do. But some of those like moments of uncertainty led to some pretty amazing opportunities. Like when I moved to Sierra Leone for a year to do a public health project on malaria prevention. Again, never saw a pathway for an engineer who is interested in social justice going to Sierra Leone to work on malaria prevention project with faith communities. But hey, there I was, and I loved that experience, and I learned a lot from it. Came back to Canada and ended up in this world of innovation policy, which I didn't know was a thing at that time. I never even knew that was like a connection that I could make with my background. So I worked for like research institutes, and then I worked for the British government, and then nonprofits. And then I ended up in this world of innovation. And it's kind of funny what I found out about innovation, which is I would always find it strange that the word innovation was kind of hijacked by the engineering technology space, when I find that the best innovation work that I did, I would lean 80% on my social sciences and 20% on my engineering to actually do good innovation. And now when I do the social impact work, to me, it's less about social impact, but it's more just about how to do good innovation by putting the communities and the users first, who have the needs, the pain points that we're trying to solve in the center as we design solutions. And I just kind of took that from classical innovation and entrepreneurship ideology and trying to apply it now in social services.
I think it's interesting too when you talk about innovation. I live in Silicon Valley. I worked in Tesla for 4 years, and you talk about it. You talk about it being like innovation being more of a people problem than a technology problem, and I think that's so true. Like most of the discussions I have around Tesla, anyways, are around the culture and not really around like the technology. I mean, the technology is like the result, I'll say, but like the unique culture and some of the approach to risk taking and things like that is really what sets the company apart, not some magical innovation machine inside the company.
And it's interesting because it might be divisive to say, but I think technology is actually the easy part of innovation. I think all those other pieces are the more difficult parts to navigate.
Well, I think like, someone said like ideas are easy too, and like building these things. I agree. But I think that especially like managing people in that environment is very difficult. I think I also had this like dream when I went to work for Tesla that it was going to be this kind of Willy Wonka chocolate factory, magic, magic goes in one end and electric cars come out the other. And you realize innovation is messy and stressful and challenging and uncertain. And that like the magic is in that. And the reason that maybe this is not always true, but the reason most people don't do it is because like that don't really innovate is because it's hard, and you had to face uncertainty and failure on a continuous basis. And I think humans are not really programmed to do that. A lot of us want predictability, those kind of things. And it takes a counterforce to push that back.
It's interesting. Even on like the innovation being hard piece, I actually try to look at it of how do I get the skill sets and the structures in place to make it easy. So I actually think innovation is hard when it's led by engineers and technologists, because they might not necessarily be the ones who have a clear understanding of the problem to be solved by a user base. And that's why I said, like, I lean a lot on the social sciences piece. And one of the big things I'm on a mission of is how to get more social sciences into the innovation world, because I think those are the groups that help make it easy, because they are the ones who help understand the why behind engineering and technology. Because the one thing when I studied engineering, I was taught how to build stuff, not necessarily the why piece. Sometimes the why piece might be like a technical type of why, but not a why that's connected to people. Whereas the social sciences side is connected to the why that's connected to people. So for me, I keep trying to think of how to bridge that gap of how to bring social sciences at the center of innovation, and that hopefully helping mitigate some of the risk and make it a bit faster to learn about the people that we're trying to serve to design better solutions. Because I know when we talk about innovation, a lot of the innovation world is steeped in software and microelectronics. And my hypothesis around that being, it's actually easier to break software and fix it faster than it is to do on larger types of hardware. And that allows kind of engineering and technologists to fail fast and move quickly and change lines of code. But one of the big pieces is, well, what about these areas where it's much more complex to design a solution? How do we innovate in those communities and in those problem spaces? And that's where I think kind of like tapping into the social sciences folks could be quite valuable.
Yeah, I agree. Like I have this, I mean, I think this is a rabbit hole we can go deep down, but I mean, Silicon Valley is like this concentration of influence around the world for good or for bad. And you kind of hear there is like it attracts a lot of talented people. A lot of the people from the top schools come here to make money basically. And you hear a lot of like kind of the tech leaders saying that there's too many smart people chasing not necessarily bad ideas, but chasing like money making ideas, right? And like, SaaS, like software as a service, do we really need another photo sharing app, or like a dog walking app or something like that when those people could be working on, whether it's the social challenges you're talking about or climate change and the challenges that brings. But there is market forces that drive people towards, what makes money and what makes money quickly, and there's some unique properties of software that are kind of like infinite margin, no shipping costs that drive that incentive very hard. And I think it's hard to stem the momentum on that sometimes.
And this may actually be like, it's kind of transitioning into my work right now at the North Pine Foundation. And one of the things on my mind, and you kind of mentioned it about like the ideas that we're chasing and driving towards. So I'll give you an example. One of the populations that we're trying to work with in the North Pine Foundation, it's former prisoners. And one thing that you find is like, so Canada as a country, we spend $5 billion, about $5 billion annually on our prisons and jails. That's not including all corrections costs, but just like the prisons and jails. And then we look at the numbers around prison recidivism being anywhere between 15 to 25% of people who end up back in prison within 2 years of being released. It costs us about $80,000 to $100,000, and in some cases more per year to house a prisoner. So the prison recidivism opportunity in Canada is probably about $1 billion opportunity, i.e., and I kind of look at opportunity based off of how much is already being spent there. So then I think about a conversation I was having with a person who runs a halfway house in Calgary. It's called 7 Step. They recently lost their funding from the United Way because, of course, Alberta kind of going through recession, and that's what happens in Alberta. Much of the philanthropy comes from oil money. So when it goes through recession, lots of philanthropy kind of disappears. And I asked her a question. I was like, okay, how many people do you serve in a given year? They're like about 250. And I was like, what's your budget? Like when things are going okay, what's your budget to serve those communities? And she said 140,000. I was like, 140,000 only. I'm like, even if you helped reduce prison recidivism of that population of 250 by around 3-4%, you are worth at least $500,000 at the minimum. And here you are struggling to get any bit of funding. So as much as I think about the whole human-centered design approach for some of these vulnerable communities that we're trying to serve, the other side is how do you create a solutions economy that can actually help drive some of that? And it's actually not creating a new economy because we're already spending money in these areas. And that's one of these other big challenges I need to figure out. It's okay, as much as we can think of doing human-centered design and putting the users first and solving their pain points, how do you sustainably create innovation and impact when you're serving these communities is a big piece.
Yeah. And what comes to mind in those spaces is like the market forces are not driving to solve the problems. Do you know what I mean? Like the market, like when I think about traditional economics, like the market is not incentivized to solve those problems. And like kind of how can you like lubricate the market or to create the incentives that other private or nonprofit organizations can actually, have an incentive to do that, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And well, one of the other things is what that incentive and what the market forces look like, because lots of these communities, when I think about who is the so-called customer of these innovations, is probably the government in many cases, in the sense that they're the ones who are currently spending the money on it. But that being said, who are the key stakeholders and influencers in the government? That's typically us as a society. So if we as a society say that this population being put into the box of whatever it is good enough, we're not actually enabling those market forces to drive towards solutions for these people. So one of my strategic aims with the foundation is to actually look at groups that I kind of call blue ocean groups, where not a lot of people, there's people doing work on the ground in the field, but then as a society, we kind of have this broad perception of understanding these groups in boxes, and in some case being fine with that. As much as we don't like it, we'd like to see better. We haven't seen too much change there. And how is it we can go there? Because for me, that's a blue ocean opportunity of how to work within those communities. One of the other communities I'm going to start working with, is actually rural Newfoundland and Labrador. And these are communities that, one of the things that underlies all the communities I want to work with, it's amplifying and valuing the voice of the people that we're trying to work with. And I'm just getting started right now, but I'm really excited to try to find ways to invest and support people in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly poverty in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, because as a province, many people might know this, Newfoundland and Labrador, I believe, has the most significant amount of poverty per percentage compared to the rest of the provinces, if you exclude the territories. So I also see that as a big opportunity area too.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It's probably not something that, at least for me, if I'm being honest, it doesn't come top of mind, but I'm sure there is, I've no doubt there is. When I saw somewhere recently that the population of St. John's or the Avalon had grown by 20 or 30% in the last 5 or 10 years or something like that. But most of it's at the cost of the small communities, and I have no doubt that there's the since 1992, there's just been a slow degradation of services and support for those communities, and especially with aging populations and limited resources from the government. I don't doubt it's putting people in a lot of people. I wouldn't say a lot of people, but a small proportion of the population in very challenging circumstances. Yeah, especially with respect to skills and things like that, where it's it's very difficult. It's easy to say to retrain people to be able to do different types of work, but I think it's that's a more complicated social problem than most people think it is.
Yeah, and that's actually why another piece of the strategy with the foundation is to do what we call population level outcomes rather than specific sector areas. So for example, we're not necessarily saying that we're focusing on education or health or employment, but rather look at populations. And that allows us to be solution agnostic, because it allows us to understand the needs of the population and then invest in areas that are solving some of the key pain points. Because the one thing I was kind of concerned with is kind of falling in love with an idea without properly understanding the needs of the community. So it's first understanding the needs and then see what ideas come from there, and that will inform where we work.
Yeah, I think I don't know a lot about social sciences, but the little I do understand, it seems people are so complicated, and societies in general, and I think you talked about falling in love with ideas, and I think sometimes these experiments, or you hear, I used to listen to the Freakonomics podcast a lot, and they talked about how these different social experiments have kind of opposite effects that you might think, and that maybe being objective and trying to understand what the impact of those, being tied to getting the measurable outcomes you want, but not being tied to the specific approach that that intuitively feels like it might work, but maybe it doesn't when it goes into practice. I don't know if you have any examples like that. Is there any examples you have where something you thought was really going to work and didn't work in a social sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's the classic innovation problem. The idea that you initially think of is likely going to fail. And that's kind of seen in innovation 80% of the time, until you go out to the people that you're trying to serve to de-risk it and then find out what is the piece of the idea that's going to work. Right now, I'm just getting started with the foundation, but that's one of the big pieces that we want to do is, and that's why our strategy is to put the people who are facing the pain points and who face the consequences and or benefits of any solution at the center of the table, because that is going to be the number one and most important signal that says which idea works and which idea doesn't work. And then we kind of iterate around that, just like how any kind of classical product manager would do. So that's actually going to be our approach. And I'm looking forward to kind of building up those relationships with the community, and especially with people who are already working out there, who are really in tune and connected to these communities, to build up partnerships with them to help understand that.
Can we go backwards a little bit to North? Can you tell us a little bit more about what North Pine Foundation is? Maybe what the genesis. There's not a lot of information online. Mm-hmm. I did try and do some research, but I'm curious. Can you kind of describe a bit more context around where it is and kind of maybe some of the genesis of that?
Yeah, sure. The North Pine Foundation is a Startup Philanthropic Foundation. The reason that you don't find as much information on the internet is because right now it's an employee of one, which is me, which I'm looking to build up my team as fast as possible. But essentially, our scope is to work across Canada. Like I said, I just started in January, so it's been a lot of exploration and nailing down the strategy. Fortunately, we have some good backing to be one of the most giving foundations in Canada. From a strategy point of view, like I said, we're focusing on those population level outcomes, giving us the ability to be solution agnostic, to like build solutions that are solving the most critical needs or interesting areas that is kind of the community is informing. The type of people, and actually this is a good timing on this podcast because I'm about to do on a big hiring blast, but the type of people that I'm really interested to bring on the team are leaders of lived experience from the various communities that we want to serve. So those various communities are foster children, of which there's 65,000 in Canada, former prisoners. So for the 100,000 prisoners who are released each year, likely, like I said, 15 to 25% of them might end up back in prison within 2 years. So dealing with the prison recidivism issue. Looking at refugee newcomer adults, of which there's about 90,000 in Canada. And then, of course, the final one, as I mentioned, it's rural Newfoundland and Labrador, likely key poverty issues in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. So those are like the 4 areas. And I have a 5th kind of special initiatives basket where it's really compelling cases that might not fit within any of those previous 4 that we're interested to look at. And underlying all this is going to be a deep understanding of impact. So we want to understand what works, what doesn't work. As a philanthropic foundation, I don't see philanthropy can't solve all of Canada's deepest issues, but what we can do, we can help solve some of the acute issues while at the same time being a learning engine to help systemic impact. So I think being the learning engine is going to be a big piece for us. And within that comes the complete ability to fail on ideas and learn from it as well. So this is a bit of the scoping around the North Pine Foundation. But yeah, looking to kind of serve these types of communities across Canada.
Who can you tell me who are the stakeholders or the is it kind of government funding or private industry or private individuals? Like kind of who are the backers, I guess, of the foundation, just for context?
Yeah. So right now, the backers are private, a group of private individuals who come from a tech investment background. And yeah, that's like a little bit about them. They're really amazing people, and they prefer to remain anonymous, but we'll see how well that works for them going forward. But they are the people behind it are just absolutely amazing when it comes. And I think maybe potentially because of that tech investment background, they're not necessarily, and the reason they hired me is because I'm not necessarily interested in tech solutions. But the one thing from the tech innovation mindset that I carry, it's putting the human first, the person first that we're trying to serve, and then wrapping around all solutions around them. So that's kind of the approach that's being funded.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. I mean, because I do, back to like the Facebook thing, I think they took the opposite approach. It seems like, the move fast and break things, and they put the people at the bottom of the list, and you see the consequences of that. Maybe it took a long time for those consequences to come to fruition, but all kinds, we don't have to go down those issues, but not putting the customer or people at the center, there's real consequences to not doing that.
Yeah. And I think especially when we look at the communities that we're trying to serve, that's even more important. So, and I'll kind of draw an analogy. So previous to this role, I was the executive director of Startup Edmonton, which is the city's early stage tech incubator. And when I look at kind of like private sector startups, you kind of hear this terminology of being customer obsessed. And it's not necessarily for any like good and charitable intentions. It's because the customer has all the power. Because the other term that you hear in the startup world quite a lot is willingness to pay of the customer. And it's not necessarily about financial return, I imagine, as much as it is, but it shows a signal that validates the value proposition that you're creating through your products and services. So if you have customers that are willing to pay and who are paying and you're getting traction, that's showing a signal of validation of value. At the same time, you could have someone, and I kind of come from an engineering background, so I joke around about this, but like you can have someone who has like a fantastic shiny widget idea that just says, if only I could get this out into the world, I could solve climate change or whatever the case might be. But if it's not actually connected to the needs of the customer and translatable in that way, you can have this shiny widget that dies off. And that's actually also what drives investment into startups, is like investors look at, are you solving a problem? How, like, who are the people behind solving this? Are you able to kind of solve that problem with value? I'll invest in you. If they don't see that traction, then your investment dies off, ideally speaking. So that is like a validation of value. Governments kind of have something similar, where like, if you think of like the so-called customer being the citizen, which validates the value of a government through your vote. But when we look at some of these communities, I'm always asking the question of how is it that they value or validate the value proposition being posed by anything going their way. In many cases, there's lots of intermediaries. In many cases, the decision makers might not be a part of that community. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to navigate. It's how do I understand these signals that we're actually creating value for these communities? And there's structural ways of doing it. There's like, putting the community up front, including them in the governance structure and things like that. But that's a bit of what I'll be navigating.
I'm curious to know, maybe you haven't been doing this portion for a while, but do you sometimes get skepticism from these communities to say like people have come to kind of try and help before and either just it didn't work or left, decommitted after a period of time? Do you get a sense of that?
Hands down, 100% yes. It is a completely rightful skepticism, of course. And that's actually one of the reasons why I'm actually trying to figure out how to structure. So one of the things is like, I'm figuring out how to structurally mitigate good intentions to actionable impact. So the one thing I kind of think is when the human rights of a particular population are at the whims of people's intentions, that's when I'm quite cautious.
Yeah. Someone, if I can interrupt for a second, I think someone said like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I think even when you look at, this is a big tangent, but like communism, even in some way is like, has very good intentions, you know what I mean? But it's like the consequences of a market built like that are very complicated, but you can argue that like the idea or the intent behind it is actually, a just one. But the consequences of how it gets enacted are a lot more complicated or have a lot more negative, maybe perverse incentives is the right way of saying it.
Yeah. And that's why I kind of take the analogy from the private sector startup space, but not on the financial return piece, but of the validation of value and being accountable to value. So in the private sector space, you're accountable to value because the customer has the power because they're paying for your solution. As soon as you're not providing the value, they can pull their funding. So I'm trying to figure out what are the methods of doing that with some of the communities that we're trying to serve, of how do we be accountable to the outcomes that we're aiming to work on, that is also driven by that community that we're trying to serve. And that's kind of what I'm trying to sort out now, is how do we structure that? Like how that we can be accountable to outcomes. And so, because I completely understand why any of these communities would be skeptical of people with good intentions. And anyone who's actually been in a hard spot will know that as well. So it is something that I'm trying to figure out 2 months in as I get building the organization.
Yeah, I won't put you on the spot to come up with solutions now, but I was just curious to know if you've kind of run across that.
It's a good mental exercise, though.
Yeah, I've no doubt. I think I was gonna, maybe if I can talk about GlobalNL for like a minute, and then I may ask for kind of some feedback or your perspective. I've been working, Kingsley Gifford and do you know Kingsley by chance?
I don't know if I do.
Okay, because he did engineering, I thought a year or two behind me, so like he might be around your age. But either way, so Kingsley and I met over dinner in Toronto. We had been kind of in similar circles, but kind of formally met in Toronto about 5 years ago. And both of us were kind of trying to do two separate things, but similar, more so just trying to connect. He was trying to connect the Newfoundland community in Toronto to the university. And I just moved from Houston to Silicon Valley and really saw almost no Newfoundlanders here. And not that I'm trying to accelerate the brain drain by any means, but I think trying to get people exposure to different opportunities, outside of the oil industry. I think diversifying the Newfoundland economy, I think, is super important, and trying to get people experience outside of those, we'll say, traditional industries is something I'm passionate about. And also, like, kind of outside of the tech ecosystem, getting additional investment funneling from either investors in the rest of Canada or in Silicon Valley. There's been limited investment from those those places where there's huge access to capital here. And that you see it has real impact. The Verafin acquisition recently is a big indicator of the value that could be produced by that kind of innovation and investment. So that was kind of like my primary focus has been on connecting kind of Newfoundland to Silicon Valley in a general sense. But I think, like, kind of stepping back from that, we're trying to create a vibrant, mostly online community of Newfoundlanders, we've been careful to say not just Newfoundlanders, but people passionate about the province, because not everyone is, from there, or either moved there or is kind of just connected to the community. But connect that expat community to each other. And then sometimes I call it this conduit that allows the expats to stay connected to Newfoundland, and then the province to stay connected to that diaspora. And the podcast has been a really good, it's been really rewarding for me to get to meet a whole host of people that I otherwise wouldn't have. And I think, like, sharing the stories like yours, I think, are fascinating. And I think I'm less excited about, we'll say, the super famous Newfoundlanders, nothing against them, but most of them already have, their kind of stories on the front page of the paper. But I think, people like you that are still in the trenches trying to make an impact, I think, is really exciting. And I kind of go to this, you can't be what you can't see thing, and I think sharing stories of people that have had big and small success, or just kind of taking unconventional paths, I think is something that's really important. And I think podcasting is kind of a way of doing that in a long form way. You do really get to know someone, I think, through a longer form conversation.
Yeah. And there's one thing that I love the GlobalNL approach of leveraging people who have a connection to the province as bridges to other places. Because whether we look at it from a social, cultural, economic perspective, building more bridges is a good thing. It hands down is. So tapping into this community of people and kind of harmonizing it into a type of platform of, like, a connected community that's spread around the world that can all find ways to connect among each other in such a way that helps fuel a stronger Newfoundland and Labrador, I think, is really important. The other thing I kind of learned through this process of being a Newfoundlander who is now away is, and it's going to sound a bit odd, but knowing where to draw my own line. So I remember doing, like, the last election where all of a sudden this big debate sparked between Newfoundlanders in Alberta and Newfoundland about which way the election went. And I wrote a blog post about this because in the time I was actually in Nova Scotia at the time of the election. And it goes back into amplifying the voice of the people who are the ones we're focused on. So as much as I'm a Newfoundlander from away, I also kind of know my place and how I can speak of and to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians who are actually living there right now. Because I left Newfoundland in 2008. Lots of stuff have changed since 2008. Sure, I go back every now and then, but I'm not living there. So I also make it a point to really keenly listen to what's going on in Newfoundland and try not to make assumptions that I know what's going on in Newfoundland just because I grew up there. So I kind of take that as a responsibility of myself of if I'm someone from Newfoundland and Labrador who lives away, who still wants to contribute back to Newfoundland, it's doing a whole lot of listening of what's happening in Newfoundland right now. What are the things that are going on that gives me a sense of it? So I don't accidentally bring back my 12-year-old knowledge of Newfoundland from when I left and trying to frame any of my engagement with Newfoundland based on that, but understanding the evolution of Newfoundland and Labrador and how I can connect into that evolution.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a real challenge, I think. Like, I've been away for 8 or almost 9 years. I moved away from Newfoundland in 2012. So maybe not as long as you have, but it's harder to stay connected being away. In some ways it's easier with technology, and GlobalNL has certainly kept me connected even more. But I think it's still difficult to get a great sense of like, of what's going on there. I just spent 2 months there. So you do, like, being there for that long, you do get a better idea of the challenges that the province is facing or what some of the needs are. But I agree. And I think part of the goal of this is to really just to maintain some of the connection, right? It's like to be able to share stories and to facilitate connection and to not necessarily force certain things to happen, but to just build the platform to hopefully kind of facilitate connection and then to let what happens. And I think for me, like, my interest is in technology in Silicon Valley and some of those areas I talked about, but there's a million other things that are out there that people are trying to do that need support and connection. I think the important thing, and maybe this is as I've gotten older, it does kind of matter who you know. And that makes people uncomfortable, but it also it doesn't have to be a family friend, and like a warm connection can make a huge difference. And I think trying to I've also say this phrase that, like, if we don't go to bat for each other, kind of who will? And I think trying to create a sense of, I won't say obligation, but to make that easier for people. Like, maybe we can be a platform to help people to go to bat for each other, and it could be a small cup of coffee or helping someone get an internship or, maybe fund a company, or it could be any of those things, but to be able to help facilitate that.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like when I think of like how I approach it, I think of myself as like a community servant of Newfoundland Labrador, which is different than being the community in which I'm serving. And it's like you said, it's like you try to find the different ways that you can. Like, we're all human and we all have different assets and skills that we can help, like you said, give a platform in different ways. I always just try to understand that of like, how is it that I can provide a platform in a kind of way that makes sense for people in Newfoundland Labrador. The other piece is there's also other times when you just kind of run off and do your own things. Like I just created a scholarship or like an award at Memorial University on anti-racism research. And that's just because it was a field that I'm passionate about. I see that every single sector is affected by racism. So I actually made it an award that could connect to any master's or doctorate student doing research in the field of anti-racism in any department. And it's just like, it wasn't that much. It's like $1,000 a year, but it was hopefully just to help support anyone doing work in that field. But here I am, someone from outside of Newfoundland. And even though like my anti-racism work that I've been doing across Canada has actually been pillared by Newfoundland, it was teachers from Newfoundland and Labrador that helped us create Teacher's Guide. Shout out to Trevor Taylor in Fogo Island and Richard Churchill in Clarenville. But there's teachers like that helped us create the anti-racism education platform and resources for Salaam B'y. So it's one of these things that I wanted to draw this intersection with this knowledge that I knew of Newfoundland and Labrador growing up with this emerging field of research and see what happens. And so, yeah, people are going to do one-off things here and there that connect to what they're interested in too, because everyone's human.
Yeah. I just the last thing on GlobalNL, I'm curious to know, do you have, we're still trying to figure out, we'll say what our mission is. Like we try and clarify it and we're trying to re-clarify it, but I'm curious to know, like, do you have any feedback for us, or how do you think, the expat community can, what GlobalNL or how it can have the biggest impact, or any kind of thoughts or feedback that I always like to get people's perspective on it?
I think you kind of hit it on the head. It's one of the most important things that anyone can do once they leave Newfoundland and Labrador is, how do you find a way to kind of keep like a stickiness? And of course, in like the innovation world, we call it like customer stickiness, but some type of connection back to the province, whatever it might be. So the fact of GlobalNL providing a platform that can be interdisciplinary, that people can find ways to give back and build bridges, and whatever bridges they can make and whatever sectors they can make, I think that's a great way of doing it. Like, it's being very open, is very solution agnostic of whatever people can bring. Like, if you're a Newfoundland and Labradorian who's away and you want to find some way of connecting to build bridges for Newfoundland and Labrador, yeah, come be a part of it. And we figure it out as we go. I think number one, building up that community to show like there's a platform that you can connect back to Newfoundland and Labrador and help serve the place that you love. And you can do it in a way that makes sense for you. I think those are two really good steps. The how piece, it's all going to be like you figure it out as you go. But I think those are two critical steps.
Yeah, it's even fascinating. This is like a minor thing, but we have a database of over 2,000 people now, which is kind of connected to LinkedIn. But there's also a map feature, which again is interesting. We kind of always hear about, there's, I think, more people living outside of Newfoundland that are from there than there is at home. And but there's a map feature that shows where people are. And it's actually really fascinating to see, across the world where people are. And it just creates this kind of cool representation of, it can help you stay connected to Newfoundland in your local community, to people that have a similar upbringing as you. But then if you're living in Newfoundland and want to get a better understanding of a certain part of the world, it might be a way for you to connect with people. And you can do messaging through that directly now, which is nice. It's private. It keeps people's emails private, but you can kind of connect with people that way too. So again, we have no idea how people will use that, but we hope by kind of creating visibility will help kind of organically create connection.
And it's interesting. So even when I worked in the world of entrepreneurship and when I would speak to investors, they're like, you know what? And like, so I was working at Startup Edmonton, and investors would tell me, for any of the companies that you're serving, many of the companies end up going to the local spot. That's where they do their customer discovery work of understanding the market, because that's what you have access to and that's what you know. But then, of course, many investors will say, well, show me that you've connected to other markets and that there's some customers or understanding there. And just kind of honing in on the entrepreneurship and diversification piece, that's something where GlobalNL has a ton of power. So say, for example, there's an entrepreneur or innovator based somewhere in Newfoundland and Labrador who wants to build a solution that solves just because you're at Tesla, I'll say like a lithium battery thing, or you were at Tesla. Yeah. But essentially, if they have the ability to then go and maybe, who knows, maybe there's a local market of like 10 businesses that work on battery storage in Newfoundland, and they have access to them, they can talk to them, but then they can go onto the GlobalNL channel, and who knows, maybe they find people based elsewhere in the world. Like maybe there's someone based down in Chile who is like, has connections to people working in the battery space or somewhere else in the world. and it allows you to make a connection. That social network, it's so like, I cannot state how important that is for any kind of entrepreneur or anyone designing any new solution. Getting access to those conversations is huge. I think that was like, it's more important than money at that point, of just getting access to those conversations, of talking to those customers to validate your ideas and build out your market. It's enormous. And that's something that GlobalNL can be a platform for as well.
I think, I think your point is actually, we've talked about it during our goal setting exercise this year around, whether geography is the most important thing, or like creating these more topical or theme-based discussions, and that connecting people based on areas of interest is probably more valuable than geography, and you could be working on cryptocurrency in Clarenville, but, in New York or in China or something like that. And to create some community around those topics, I think is something we're going to spend more time on. Like, the one example we do have is we kind of have a GlobalNL Slack group that's gotten, we use it for kind of running the organization, but there's one channel in there that has, a group of 7 or 8 of the local tech startups in Newfoundland. And then, I'm in the channel and a couple of other kind of expats. And it's just really fascinating to see that conversation. There's lots of basic things from real estate, but all, how do we get access to this expertise? And like, you see the founders kind of self-supporting, but then periodically looking for external perspectives. And like, it just, and you can never pin down the value that creates, but there's something there, right? By helping those people connect with each other, and having, the global community to be able to be a part of that's important.
Yeah, for sure. That the access to that collective knowledge that's worth a lot. Like, that is.
Yeah. Sometimes I like to say we need to like harness the power of the I hate the word power for some reason, but like to harness the expertise, it's all those things pulled into one. How do we harness that community? There's a lot of people that have had success in big and small ways, and we need to figure out a way to harness it, I think.
Yeah. But I think it's like every step of the way, like you're doing now with the podcasts, with the kind of creating those channels, it's like one step at a time.
Yeah, I think this is something that Kingsley and I have said we want to be doing 20 or 30 years from now. And the progress is, I wouldn't say it's slow, but it's like, we're trying to think about this on a long-term basis, and we're trying to do it in an organic way. And it's working. I think we don't have infinite amounts of time to work on it. But we're looking to raise money this year and probably hire someone like in a similar position that you're in, like kind of an executive director that can either work on a part or maybe full time. But we've got a great group of around 7 or 8 volunteers that are very dedicated, that spend probably 4 or 5 hours a week or every second week working on it. And we have a partnership with the university. So like there's a real need and interest for people in Newfoundland as well as expats to be like, they want to be a part of it. So it's, the interest is there. We're trying to be patient at the same time.
Nice. I love it.
Okay. The last question that I do ask everyone, I did steal this question from a podcast, one of my favorite podcasts, Tim Ferriss, but he always asks his guests, if you could put a message on a billboard. Sometimes I tell people at St. John's Airport, but you can kind of put a metaphorical billboard anywhere. What would you say, and where would you put it?
So I'm actually I'm gonna steal the postcard and the kind of motto that we've been having with the Salaam B'y tour across Canada that we did in 2019, which was the Communities of Kindness tour. And on our postcard, it says, be kind, for whenever there's kindness in something, it beautifies it. So that would be my thing, of be kind.
I like that. Okay. I think the last thing I was going to ask is where can we find, where can people view the Salaam B'y documentary? I have looked extensively, but haven't been able to find this. I'm curious to know, is it like, can be basically people view it now?
Yeah.
Where can they find it?
It's we recently last year we had it on Amazon Prime. Now we're taking it down, and we're actually working with, so one of our key big goals of the documentary was, incidentally, it wasn't actually public consumption. It was putting it into archives and history books of a story of a Muslim Newfoundlander. So we're fortunate to have the Newfoundland collection, Newfoundland Labrador archives, take it on, as well as we're working with Library Archives Canada to take it on, which then would allow for online viewing now that we've taken it off of Amazon. That being said, in the meantime, we offer the documentary and the anti-racism education materials, which is steeped in anti-racism, but it's kind of anti-discrimination of all lenses. It's actually available for free for any teachers or community educators, community organizations that work in this field. And that can be accessed through our website. So salambby.ca, and you see an educators tab. You just enter in some information, and then we send you the materials.
Okay, great. Maybe I'll look for the link. If I can't find it, I'll let you know. And then we can include that in the show notes and the YouTube video as well.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. That's all the questions I had. Any parting comments or questions for me? Anything else before we sign off?
No, thanks for doing this. I actually, I did bring this down next to me because I love it a lot, the GlobalNL award. So I was really excited to receive that. It actually, I got to say, being a citizen of Newfoundland and Labrador means a lot for me. And now being away means a lot for me to continually serve the place that I love, that helped raise me. And sometimes when you're doing this kind of stuff, and I know you and Kingsley are doing it right now, when you're on the journey, you're unsure how people are taking it and absorbing it. But then when you get that point of validation by the community that you're trying to serve, it is a really warm feeling. It is absolutely amazing. So I actually want to send you and Kingsley that warm feeling as well, that what you're doing in GlobalNL, it's really great. It's really fantastic. And looking forward to seeing what happens next.
Yeah, I think if I can share that sentiment, it is really, I hate to say sometimes the effort feels futile, because I know it's not, but sometimes you can be are we really having an impact, and is this worth the effort? And it's the uncertainty around that. But I think, and we're trying to do a better job of telling these stories. These conversations I have with you and maybe Bethany Downer, the inspiring astronaut, or, Nathan Young, who went to the Youth Olympics, you have these conversations are really fascinating. And it's really amazing stories to tell, but those things are what keep me motivated, And I think the other thing I'd recommend to you, if you haven't had the time, is to read Andrew Furey's put a book out just before the election. And this is not meant to be a political plug by any means, but he talks mostly about Team Broken Earth in there, and that similar sentiment that he was kind of highly discouraged that what kind of impact are you going to have in a community like that? And he had a quote in there that said, we're not trying to change the world, but we are trying to change someone's world. And whether it's that one individual that he saved, someone's leg or whatever it might be, maybe you don't save the whole country, but he made a difference in that person's life. And I think thinking about it through that lens is a much easier way to stay motivated when you're not trying to boil the ocean, we'll say. But I thought it was a really good perspective in that book. Provided a lot of, at least in the nonprofit space, trying the kind of perspectives on how to stay motivated and to have impact.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I like that line.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say, I was watching a TV show this weekend, and he had a line in this thing, and said, if you want a lesson in can a small thing have a big impact, spend a night in a small room with a mosquito and see what you think in the morning. And maybe with some of your malaria work, the power of mosquitoes. So maybe
Yeah.
You and I are that mosquito that we need to keep picking away.
For sure.
Okay. All right. I'll let you go. Thanks, Aatif. And we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Greg.
I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by GlobalNL. A special thank you to my co-host Jeremy Andrews, editor Hi Nim, and producer Frank Smythe. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to sharing more stories about Newfoundlanders and Labradorians doing interesting and amazing things around the world.